there's a social service worker, but they've got to come from North London when we're working in West London. And those things over time have gradually eroded the sort of other support services that police might otherwise be involved in. And on top of that, the complexities of policing have also increased. So, for instance, when I first was appointed a chief officer in my last police force, we had no such concept of cybercrime. Now we have not only within the police a whole cybercrime department, nationally as well as locally, but even the military have set up a cyber warfare organization. And that's just in a relatively short period of time, in the last 10, 15 years. So complexity of demand within the police for proper police work is one thing. And added to that is this erosion of other services to which the police inevitably find themselves being drawn into.
So, all of this doesn't happen in a vacuum. What about the role and expectations of the public? How do you deal with that from a policing perspective? To meet the need, if you're there, as I've heard the term before, by public consent, I'm not sure people these days would agree that that's the case. What does the public need to be being realistic about this?
Okay, so this goes back to the sort of the sort of Rousseau concept of social contract. People give over a certain amount of their freedoms in exchange for the state providing them with protection and support. And part of that responsibility is for police, for the society itself, to follow certain rules and agreements that are made as part of that social contract. Not overtly committing offences is an obvious one, but also we've become a society, and this is a very westernized thing, but I notice when I go around to other countries, the Middle East and in Africa, society is becoming very entitled, in inverted commas. It's entitled to make all sorts of demands on authority. And along with that entitlement, there also seems to be a reducing accountability factor in their equation. So they make more demands, but with less and less personal responsibility. And so we find ourselves in a situation where all sorts of demands are made of the police, from cat up the tree to whatever else. People not really thinking through their own responsibilities about their behaviours and their demands on what is a paid for public service. So there's a component of that entitlement. But also what we have to recognize is that in many developed countries, there is a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. So a lot of demand for policing happens to be in places that are short on housing, good welfare, good medication, good education. And so we end up getting ourselves into an almost decaying spiral of reaction to demand, which seems to be out of sync with the general premise that the police should be treating people equally. They should be administering justice in its widest form. So I think there's no one, to go back to your original question, there is no one particular strand that is you could put your finger on and say that's the problem. What the current situation is doing is highlighting where some of the flaws in society are, as well as in the thing that is often represented by society, which is the police.
Yeah, very complex. So a couple more questions here. There was a very interesting TEDx talk that you referred me to with a U.S. officer speaking in Oxford, England, about evidence-based policing. And so maybe, talk about that to the degree it's useful for the question of what do we want our police to be doing. But also she mentioned the role and scope of individual police officer discretion, and sometimes they are put in the vise between their superior officers who say do something and their own situation on the ground where they may disagree, but if they disagree they may lose their job. And so any thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, again, this has what might look like a sort of simple explanation, but it too is quite complicated. If you look at it from the point of view of the demands on police, and yes, there's an emphasis on law enforcement within the United States, but the reality is the police in the United States probably spend as much time doing what I often call street cleaning activities, in the same way as that are done in the UK. They're sorting out issues, they're sorting out problems, they're bringing other skills to intervention other than just the enforcement of a particular law. But the trouble is, it's very much like if you give a child a hammer, then all the issues look like nails. And the problem with the police is you start saying that in order to show or to demonstrate your competence, we're going to count the number of arrests you make, the number of stops you undertake, the number of investigations you successfully conclude. Then we're starting to steer the police towards a behavior. It's almost like, training to pass the SATs test. Ask yourself the question, how relevant is that in the bigger world in terms of determining whether somebody is educated or not? So going back to the point I made earlier on about the training and how we develop police officers, if we keep on focusing on things that can be measured, like number of arrests, stops, and that sort of thing, we're going to miss the point. They're not going to be able to exercise the discretion that they're allowed within their police policies to ensure that they give the right sort of service that's required. That, for me, is probably one of the most challenging, because it's often people outside of the police, and I experienced this in the UK in the 1980s, 1990s, this performance culture that starts to drift away from what the people actually want and start to count things that are easily countable and determine that those are the most effective forms of measurement of police effectiveness.
Well, then you get that tied back with recruiting and training, and bearing in mind that I understand from a recent conversation that while the military are in training all the time, that they're not deployed out in some operation, the police have to squeeze training in while they're out 24/7 on the street dealing with all these things we've been talking about. So, recruit who you recruit and how you train them in order to be up to date and fulfilling, a pretty demanding role in very dangerous circumstances. And that's not to excuse the, as they say, the rogue cop that does horrible things. But if there's ways to weed them out, which I think they're proposing now as part of the reforms, then that'll be a good thing. So in the minute or so we have left, Douglas, do you want to make any final comments about what do we want from our police, or what can we do to reform
Sure.
police?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that this isn't just about a couple of bad apples in the barrel. This is bigger and wider than that. And if I give you an example in terms of why the need for reform, part of my research in Kenya found that many police officers don't get involved in crimes because the last time they were trained in anything was in the recruit school. And I found one guy who'd been in the police for 17 years. And from the time he left recruit training, he'd never had any other training. So complexity of crime and things of that nature, changing in trends, had completely passed him by. And frankly, he's a waste of space. Not his fault, but the organization is not keeping him up to speed with the changes and the dynamics of policing and the challenges that faces.
But do you think that's in part to serve the leadership purposes?
It's not just the leadership.
Agendas.
Yeah, it's not just the leadership within the police, it's the political demands on what people want to see. If you have a mayor that keeps on talking about traffic stops or crime arrests or whatever it is, instead of keeping the peace and making people feel more comfortable and safe, then you're always going to have a conflict between what can be measured and what actually makes the difference.
So are you hopeful? Are we going to make some changes with everything that's been changing in the last few weeks and months?
Well,
years?
I can't imagine my involvement with policing and its development is going to end anytime soon.
Well, that's good. They're lucky. They're lucky to have you. You're deeply and widely experienced, and we really appreciate you taking the time again to be on the show here, Douglas Brand. So, if people want to reach you and ask any questions, is there an email or somewhere you want to send them?
Yeah, I can. Probably the easiest thing is just to drop me an email at my personal email, because I get inundated with stuff on my academic one. But dbrand2@hotmail.com, dbrand and the number 2@hotmail.com, and I'll respond as and when I get the opportunity.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Douglas, and you stay safe yourself as you move around the world in your great height.
Okay, good to talk to you again.
Thank you. And thanks too for our listeners for listening to the show this week. And I can't imagine you didn't gain some new insights, tools, or maybe some strategies. And do be aware that podcasts of past shows are available on the SOBradionetwork.com, which you can listen to and download. And also check out my business website, GameChangerThinking.com. And remember, the life you live is the legacy you leave. Bye now.